Well, where do you start with my special Luck on Sunday guest this week? There is hardly anything he hasn't done in this sport. From riding big winners to founding newspapers to being the face of televised racing for 3 decades. Let's just have a reminder of him 33 years ago.
It seems at the moment the horse isn't really into gear. Sharastani now takes over. Walter Swinburne goes for home. He's got the race, and now we see it answers the question: was Dancing Brave get the trip? The answer is he gets the trip very, very well. Look how he's running on. He's now got the action, but getting too far behind is what's fixed him, I'm afraid. Here's a horse as he makes ground all the way to the line. They're now hitting this final little bit of rising ground. If he was ever going to not stay, he wouldn't run up there. He really runs up this. He's catching Sharastani all the way to the line. As Greville gives him a couple of cracks there, the sparing cracks, he's closing his down. He's only beaten half a length, and I have to say, it's a personal opinion, I think he should have won a minute. Just was one of those things. He settled down. The horse, who'd always reacted quickly for Greville before, he relaxed too much. Greville Starkey's told us he got too relaxed, and when he went to attack, you can't do that through Tattenham Corner. Remember Lester Piggott's Derby victories, he always got himself into a position before Tattenham Corner. I know Golden Fleece came hurtling up a million miles an hour, but it's very rare for that to happen. And that was a Derby, I'm afraid, that was a Derby lost as much as it was a Derby won. But horse racing has always been the exact science, and I can tell you, trying to ride a racehorse, they aren't bits of machinery. When things begin to go wrong, they tend to accumulate, and that, I think, is what happened in the Derby 86.
And he hasn't changed a bit in the intervening period. Brough Scott, good morning.
Well, it's nice. The sad thing about looking at that is, of course, it was a great, extraordinary event, but Walter and Greville are both dead now, you know. And so I feel this awful thing about people saying hello like this is that, OK, you're saying hello to me because I'm still alive. But anyway, I don't want to be very clear, because I would tell a couple of things. I'm not going away. I just want to do some other things. And also, you need to move on because other people need to do the things you're doing.
I know you want to look forward to projects. The reason I chose that is because it's one of my, as doing this job, it's one of my favourite pieces to camera that is still available in the archives.
I didn't know it was there.
Because it was rare enough now, but it was even rarer then for an anchor to stand and deliver. This is a derby that was as much lost as it was won, and in my personal opinion, Greville Starkey has made a cock up here, and it wasn't popular to go put your neck on the block then. Were you conscious of that when you were doing it?
I suppose so. I mean, the problem is, an anchor, you're trying to get everyone to talk to you, as you know.
Yeah.
And if you actually, and also you don't know the information that the jockeys is particularly difficult, because with footballers, it's only the footballer and the ball. But when you've got the horse, and so if you ask a jockey what do you do, he says the horse was hanging, so I couldn't pull it out. So then you can't shop him because he said it was hanging. But he may have actually been bullshitting there. I mean, to me, actually, I mean, I feel almost harsh on the fact is he got too far behind. It wasn't all his fault, because the tactics were to drop him in. But once he dropped in, he was stuck. So it was a Derby loss.
Yeah.
You know, it was a Derby loss, there's no question about that. And the danger is people don't say it. We don't. It is very difficult, but I think it's getting better. And the thing is, well, it's much better. We're beginning to get very high-powered jockeys on board. You know, you've brought all these people through, and when they say it, you can't complain. If Ruby Walsh says, "Look, he should have gone for a long one," he can say it. But if somebody who's never sat on a horse says it, he may be right. But the jockeys then get resentful, then they won't talk, and it all gets, you know, we get the worst thing in racing is it's best thing and the worst is it's got a lot of attention on itself, but the worst thing about it is that they all squabble so much.
So do you think it's imperative then that your major analysts of a race are people who've done it, and not just people who've done it, but people who've done it to a very high standard, so that they can't be second-guessed?
No, it's not imperative, but because there are some very, very good analysts, you have them on your show, who have never sat on a horse, you know, and made of shapes that you clearly couldn't. And they're very, very good analysts. The problem is, within a very small little parish, which racing is, we have to remember that. When you look at your big studios and things, it's a very small parish. Is if they're criticised by somebody who hasn't ridden, the jockeys get cross and they won't talk to you and all that sort of stuff, and trainers too. Whereas if a top trainer or top jockey says, look, in my opinion, I think he should have gone earlier, it's only an opinion. I mean, you know, the fact is that it's inexact. If you'd gone earlier, I mean, if he'd ridden Dancing Brave right up there second, I mean, he never rode him up there second, remember? When he won the Arc, Pat Henry didn't ride him up there second or third. He dropped him right out and he pulled him back in on the turn. Pulled him back in, so he came last. I mean, that was the most daring bit of race riding I've ever seen in the Arc.
And I know one of your favourite races, and certainly one of the your most
most
enjoyable broadcasting experiences as well.
It's my most enjoyable broadcasting experience. Also, it's the greatest waiting race I've ever seen, or ever will see, because of the, as you know, the thing about race riding is which everybody wants to have, is almost wants to have, is nerve. To actually hold your powder. It's a galloping card game, to hold that ace. And Dancing Brave had the ace, but I mean, there were very good horses that all kicked. And he could have kicked earlier, and he pulled it back in, Pat Henry, pulled Dancing Brave back in. And Bering was the big thing, and let Bering go first. I mean, he came so late that the local television missed him completely. And Channel 4, doing the replay, had to stitch in another one, and I had to stall for about 40 seconds while Andrew Franklin stitched in another shot that we had, a private shot. And if you look at the replay, we show you, you do see him go past the line, but you didn't in the real time.
And this is the days before everything was digital on the server, so you actually had to physically...
There were men doing, cut and paste. I mean, that sort of stuff. Anyway.
But exciting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as you know, live broadcasting is exciting. I mean, it's not race riding, but it's exciting. And I certainly find it absolutely terrifying to start with. I mean, I still remember the very first broadcast I did for BBC, handed in by O'Sullivan. And he said something quite nice and now to Brough Scott, and I've got a microphone on me, and I absolutely looking there, terrified. And according to the private eye, but it's not true, I said, there is the unmistakable shape of Joe Mercer, or is it Lester Piggott? But I did say there is, that funny enough, Oakes did say, is it Lester Piggott, separately, but I didn't say it at that time.
Is that why you did it? Because it terrified you? Because you needed something to replace the fear?
No, I did it out of desperation because I messed up everything else. I failed as a jockey, and I walked away from doing sort of what my mother-in-law called a proper job. And I've never really had a proper job since.
What would your mother-in-law have liked you to be doing?
I don't know, some sort of... I mean, the story is a bit unfortunate, but before I got married, my mother-in-law, who was a little bit of a dragon, met my father had the sort of meeting with mother-in-laws and things. And unfortunately, the week before, I had been in front in a big race at Haydock, which is on televised, and the horse, first time in blinkers, was split free, and it did one of those spectacular dive halfway round, and they're close up on me, and it was a spectacular dive. It was a 20-run hurdle race, and they all galloped over me. I was knocked out and stuff, but needless to say, in those days I rode the next day, I fell again. But because it was such a spectacular fall, they showed it again on 10 o'clock news. And that's when they sort of met. It was a bit unfortunate. And my mother-in-law said the magic word to my father, when do you get a proper job? But anyway, I never got a proper job, but when I stopped racing, when I stopped riding, what am I going to do? And luckily, the previous year, probably the story, in 1970, I had a badly broken ankle, and those days took ages to kick. And I was stuck for the 1970 World Cup watching the telly, and ITV had a panel on which was footballers talking about football, which you'd never done before. I mean, it sounds so obvious. They used to have sort of pundits and nice chaps, and say anything was happening on racing. And I rang up Julian Wilson and said, look, I could do this. Because I knew about race riding. I didn't know about broadcasting, and I'd never been, unlike people like you, I'd never been in school acting or anything like that. I hadn't got a very good voice. But I actually had something to say. And the one thing about broadcasting, if you can't be good, be different. Because after a bit, you get used to broadcasting. Because in the end, it's, as you know, well, they do so beautifully, but it's only conversation.
You're spot on. I think that point of difference is crucial to a lot of people's careers, isn't it? Something that's their unique selling point.
But if you get that after a
facts.
bit, then you're not so terrified of broadcasting, because you realise it's only conversation.
Yeah.
The danger with television, as anyone knows who's done it, is when you start doing it, you back away, or you address the microphone as if it's a big room.
And also, we saw you there at the Derby. And, of course, in those days, 86, the Derby was still a big deal. Still a big national event.
Wednesday, big. It was a big thing.
And do you feel, as a broadcaster, that the key is to play your game rather than to play the event? So if you're playing the event, essentially, it gets you more nervous than perhaps you ought to be.
I think so. I think the most important thing about broadcasting is the first part of the word. It's trying to share.
Yeah.
It's broadcasting. And it's, it's the old line, you've only got two people, the people, you there, but you're trying to say to the camera, look, come on in, but this is what's happening. And also, to not, there's one thing I was told very, very early on, which I've always tried to stick to, is never overestimate your audience's knowledge or underestimate their intelligence. So never patronise, but don't assume they know. All sorts of words. For instance, I have a bit of a campaign, many failed campaigns, about a wind problem.
No one knows what it is.
Well, they think it means farting. That's what wind problems mean.
Yeah.
He's had a wind operation. It's a breathing problem. That's what he's got. He's got a breathing problem. He's had a breathing operation. But we seem to have lost that one. I've lost most of my campaigns, but there we are.
I don't know. I think bit by bit over time we are getting better. And I certainly think, I don't know if you agree, the access to the participants has got significantly better in the last decade or two.
I think racing it's sad for me because it's infinitely better in so many ways, but so much worse in the area I've been in, i.e. in the awareness to the public, which in a theory, my campaign since I stopped riding was to try and make more people interested in racing. The fact is that less people are interested in racing now than ever. What we do within racing, everything from the way horses are trained, the way jockeys are looked after, the way racecourses are run. The tracks, the concrete posts, in my day, rails all plastic. All that, now the access to, as you say, to jockeys, the access to the stewards. People wouldn't tell you. Yes, it was a sort of, it was bad luck because it was the last race and it was pitch dark. People forget that. Those pictures are all look as if it's all right. You couldn't see anything. But you weren't allowed, no one would tell you anything. They would still say you can't hear. All that sort of stuff. We weren't allowed in the paddock. I was seen as a revolutionary, because I didn't wear a hat. How about that?
Because you didn't?
I didn't have a hat. Of course, everyone must all wear hats. And, we had a camera in the unsaddling enclosure. And then we went up to York. We managed, this was negotiating. We got the camera, we arranged to have a camera in the paddock at Newmarket, in the paddock. No question. When I started, no question of the paddock in either the unsaddling enclosure or the paddock. No question. And we did it at Newmarket, went up to York, and the first we did it in the paddock. And this is absolutely true. And I was summoned the next day by the senior steward, who I actually knew, because I've got a public school. Well, I knew his flipping relations. Anyway, he said, well, I understand you were in the paddock yesterday with your cameras. And I'm the anchor. And I said, yeah, this is a Newmarket, so you can't do it up here. And I literally said to him, look, I'm going out to I've got 8 minutes, I'm going out to the opening. And I'm going to go and do it in the paddock. If your people come and stop me, I'll come and do it outside the paddock and I'll tell them what's happened. I'm going out now. And walked out. And I did it in the paddock. We've been in the paddock ever since. But that's how stuffy people were. Now, they're all leaning over backwards. But in the meantime, the public interest in racing, when I first took over the Sunday Times, 73, previously there had been 2 Sunday Times journalists. There aren't any now. I do reports for them every now and then, that's more. Every paper had writers. Now, people like David do masses of stuff online and on Saturdays and things, but the basic writers don't happen. The actual narrative of racing in the papers doesn't really exist. We just have 2 pages of grids. Those cards, ordinary person, my children have no idea how those grids work.
Because it's abstract. It's totally abstracted. It's
only, and they're only there. It is then only a betting game. If racing is only a betting game, it's doomed, because there's also other betting games which actually are much more accessible, like football and things. Which is why front of betting shops have football, well, not racing on them. But racing is a very interesting betting game, and it needs to be made interesting, but it's got to have a narrative at the top of it. If you don't follow racing in general, you've had it. And that's why it is important to have it on network television. It's very important to have a narrative. And it's very important to have competition. You know, if you don't have competition, you have some of these things like, I mean, the best will in the world, it's fantastic how well they've done Coolmore, but if we have a situation where the Derby, which is an absolutely ultimate sort of Formula One race, you imagine a Formula One race when 7 of the 13 starters were Mercedes. I mean, it would just be ridiculous.
And that is the
That
case
was Coolmore.
for the last decade.
Yeah.
The 7 of the 13
And
starters.
racing within doesn't sort of look how it looks from the outside. I think it's terribly important about broadcasting. You look in as what does it look like from the outside? Not say how we got here, well, we do it because this is what's happened. Look, so one of my things, I think you should actually consider having only 2 runners from any one team.
So from any one ownership group or any one trainer?
I think probably I think one ownership group, if it becomes trainer, because I mean that's it. You know, if you 2 is fine, but the fact is you have 7, without breaking the rules, you're blocking the others. Well, it's just a fact. Everybody knows that. You're blocking the others, and you have a look at Huntinghorn and Enable in the King George. I mean, that's just a fact. If I was doing Coolmore, I'd do exactly the same. But those are the rules we have. They actually legislate against competition at the moment. And I just think people have to think radically because we are losing interest in racing. Look at the newspapers. And very soon, if someone pulls the cards, after the Guardian do it, they just have one meeting or something. And they do have writers. If you can't keep a narrative...
still have 2 writers, which is fantastic. And
unless racing has a story to tell, it's just a betting game, it's doomed. I mean, it's a very interesting betting game, and that's what it should be sold as, because it's not crack cocaine racing. Racing's actually got to think about it, and you've actually got to get involved. But it's much easier to get involved, as we know from football, if you actually follow people because you actually know about them. At the moment, who do they know? They know Dettori, they know Richard Johnson just about. I mean, literally. They know...
Well, the truth is, Brough, not sparing your blushes, there's more people out there who've heard of Brough Scott than Richard Johnson.
Well, that's only because I'm 97 years old, but basically I have been in the public eye. But you
were in the public eye at a time when racing's place in the national culture was that bit more cemented.
It was, and we used to have this sort of, you have the sort of charity lunches or whatever, and very much nothing to do with me. I'd be sort of invited along, and Saint and Greavesy and people, you'd be very much part of the same sort of gang. You were part of that gang, whereas now slipping down. I mean, Ed Chamberlain and Francesca made a big hit back in, and having McCoy and Walsh sort of high profile. But it's a big battle. But I think unless we have a narrative in the newspapers, we're really losing it. Those. I mean, it's a terrific thing because you don't have the cards, you don't get the betting.
And the truth is, when you were anchoring ITV and then Channel 4, your position as being part of that national conversation was in part because the sport was incredibly popular. If the sport's not so popular, then the people who are attached to it are not going to have quite the same standing. Yes,
I mean, it was never as popular as people in racing thought. You have to remember that. I mean,
we've always been guilty of overestimating our place in the world.
Well, since about 1920, yes, is the answer. Remember, the Derby it's quite an interesting point, this. It was the most important sporting event in Britain up until about 1926 or something, 28, when the Cup Final overtook it. And, but it was. Parliament used to stop all that sort of thing. Wednesdays... But it was going out, and when people complained about, moving it to the Saturday, it was moved to the Saturday because it wasn't working on the Wednesday.
Yeah.
I remember Quest for Fame's Derby, which was absolutely grotesque. It was pouring the rain, awful. And when you do those shots saying, isn't it amazing, 300,000 people on these glorious downs, you couldn't cut to any of them. People sort of shivering with some paper over them, and awful. And also the sort of whole atmosphere was bad. There was people mugged on the trains, and you know, with the jolly outings from London and the nice, you know, wasn't it super, the poor old Cockneys had one day out a year and they could, you know, you can't live on that.
Yeah, that narrative was gone by then anyway.
You know, William Frith's thing was 1860, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a nonsense to think you've got to live in the future, in the present and the future. And racing has a story to tell, but it's incredibly defensive about it at the moment. I think it's defensive and myopic. It doesn't look out.
In what way is racing defensive at the moment?
It's defensive about the two big issues, which are potentially toxic, or are toxic really. One is betting, and secondly is horses, animals being hurt activity. Those are the two things which people sort of start apologising for. Well, I don't think you should apologise for either of them, frankly, because betting can be very interesting. It's obviously you don't do it in excess any more than you drink in excess. In fact, it's more interesting than drinking, and potentially less
more
harmful.
lucrative, yeah.
And you use your brain rather than deadens it. But you can make a really good case for betting on horses and thinking about it. And indeed, you know, my kids find that quite interesting, but they haven't really followed it much through. Because you are calculating things, and you're calculating both mathematically and human and animal nature. So it's a fascinating mix, unique mix. And as for animal welfare, I mean, the racehorse is an extraordinary athlete, but it's, in the end, it's athletics. And it's an athlete who is trained and indeed been raised to race. That's what it does. But it's running in it's a very dangerous thing. Racing is dangerous. Let's be clear about that. It's dangerous to the people who take part, which are well, actually, betting on it is quite dangerous too. It's a risk thing. We are in my pet sort of campaign at the moment, we live in a more and more risk-averse society. To try and say you can do racing without risk is absurd. It's a very dangerous thing. You can't have a safe Grand National. It's very dangerous. If a horse goes down, you're in front of it. It goes down, you go down straight after it, and you go down smack. You're going 35 miles an hour. And if another one falls on top of you, it weighs half a ton, and if it hits you here, you get knocked out.
Well,
if it hits you here, you're crippled. You know, that's what happens. I mean, I was a very low range, really, but I was quite busy at the time. But I mean, you're going to get hit, and horses are going to hit you. Therefore, the responsibility is the awareness, but the responsibility is really on those who prepare the athletes, the humans and the horses. In the past, they didn't really care. They care more than they ever did now. They know more than they ever did. And they're better prepared and better looked after. But, which is the big but, it's a dangerous and exciting game. That's the thrill of it. That's why it's so, I mean, I promise you, there wouldn't be a day goes by I don't remember race riding and don't miss it. But I miss it like I miss being young. You know, but it's incredibly, this is a live jumping motorbike. That's what you're on. And the danger, with 30 others around you.
And the danger is an inherent part of the sport, and one that is part of the essence of the sport. Interestingly, when I was doing the job that you had previously done at Channel 4, one of the big marketing campaigns they did was horse racing, the original extreme sport.
Yeah, it was a pretty good idea.
And yet, we're only 5, 6, 7 years down the track. You wouldn't dream of doing that now within the current context, and you'd be very frowned upon by our rule makers for doing so.
I think our rule makers have got it wrong, because I don't think there's anything to apologise for. I think that you say, look, this is the deal. We are the ones who are responsible, because to start saying, well, the horse doesn't have any choice, of course he doesn't have any choice. Animals don't have a choice, otherwise it'd be hopeless. You can't, animals give the animals the vote, they wouldn't know. But because they don't have a choice, you have the responsibility. If you're the rider, you're the trainer, you're the rule makers, you're sending these animals and these athletes out. That's why, to bring it up to date, that's why the flag waving is a crucial thing, because actually you've got to have whether the flag was visible enough and all the rest of it's different, but you've got to have a rule that you stop a race. I mean, the most obvious one happens when you can't throw the stalls away in a mile-and-a-half race, which I've seen happen. And jockeys, it goes absolutely chaotic, because you're running free and you come round the turn.
And there's a set of starting stalls in front of you.
Starting all the way. I mean, people in Trinidad. Richard Fox has a story which I don't really believe, but he was in Trinidad when it happened. I think it was Trinidad, and people saw this. You know, when they're going to turn around, it's there, and they started. Some managed to pull up, some bailed out, and he was trapped on the inside. And he claims he galloped at the stalls and went straight through it. And his main punchline was that then they declared the race void.
I wouldn't mind seeing the footage if it ever appeared anyway.
I never believed it, but he used to tell the story anyway.
And as far as what they should do now, is the genie out of the bottle as regards racing's position on welfare?
I think you have to be in the front and say, look, it's very... The horses are... I mean, I don't think people... Again, can emphasise enough what an extraordinary thing, you know, the line I keep saying is the fastest weight carrying creature the world's ever seen. But you actually look at what a horse does. Half a ton can carry a man weighing, you know, can carry 11 stone for 2 miles and jump 12 fences in under 4 minutes. And it's you can go 0 to 35 in 6 jumps. You know, it makes Usain Bolt look. These are extraordinary things, but it's risky, and you know you either don't do it at all. You've got to accept the risk and be ready for it, and which is a really important one because you've got to face up to it. If you're going to get fractures. You have falls. You know, all jockeys get fractures. You know, crikey, when you rode for 10 years or something, I've got fractures in most. Everyone's got stories of fractures and concussions things. But if you have fractures with horses, euthanasia is usually the best option. And the sooner you do it, the better, and quiet horse doesn't suffer. But euthanasia with animals is the right thing anyway, because they didn't arrive here by stalk. I mean, I have horses at home. I have them for 20, 30 years. But I always say to them, I had lots of ex-race horses, but I always say to people, and I say it very carefully, you know, they'll never leave this yard alive. And I hold them when they're put down. I look into their eyes and I know that they're dispatched, but I take the responsibility. And that's what happens. You know, it's a shocking thing when a horse gets killed. I remember the first time it happened to me, a horse called Red Stag at Newbury, 25 runs or something. I'm a 7-pound claimer, and suddenly you're spinning along and it does one of those sort of flip the hurdle, turn over. And they all thunder away, and you're suddenly lying there. And actually, I remember I had quite a new saddle I got somehow or other. I won a race as an amateur, and I got given the saddle, big deal. But there was my saddle on a piece of meat. It was broken his neck. It was absolutely shattering, and always will be. But it's a risk. It's a risky thing, and you can't do it. To start going into the Grand National being absolutely terrified that there'll be a fatality, of course there'll be a fatality, almost certain this year, because we've had about 6 years without. You're going to get falls. If you have falls, it's only a question of angles for either athlete, jockey or horse. It's a question of angles. If you bounce this way, is nothing. If you just get that hand is out there, you break your arm. You know, if the horse behind you clips you, you break this, and if you've broken a shoulder, jockey, it doesn't matter. You go. If you've broken the shoulder of a horse, you've got to do this, and the quicker the better.
Well, much of that brings us around to where I started, in a sense, which is about looking after the horse and looking after the people, just as importantly, and many would say more importantly. And that is something you've devoted a significant portion of your racing life to. What is it about this sport, do you think, that makes people who, essentially your job was broadcasting the racing week to week, but what makes people become so totally immersed in it, as you have been?
Because uniquely, it can occupies you not just 7 days a week, because racing is on 7 days a week, so the thing you follow 7 days a week, but if you get involved with the horses, it occupies you 24 hours a day, because they're out there. And after all, that's why the attraction of working in stables, we rather overdo. I mean, you always make things better, but actually working in stables, it's the hours that are a problem for particularly people with families and things. But The actual thing of working stable is terrific. You wake up in the morning, and every morning you go before dawn, and there is a live animal nickering for its food, or you muck it out, you change, and then, isn't it awful? You get on a horse and ride up the hill. I mean, I can remember on sort of good mornings thinking, I'm being paid to do this. Ridiculous. But no, it's very absorbing because you've got animals as well as this uncertain thing. Also, it's a game where, most importantly of all, you have to be an optimist. You have to be an optimist. I know Tim Forster's great thing about being a great person, but I mean, he was an optimist. Of course he was. Every morning he got up complaining, but hoping that his complaints wouldn't happen. I mean, racing's main deal is the eternal battle against hope against expectation, isn't it? That's what it is. You get up in the morning, and you never know, even this useless horse that never won a race, well, he looks a bit better today, and he's et up, and you can dream it. Anybody who has a share in a horse, you can, well, I don't know, and they say last time he's a bit unlucky, and the rest of it. In fact, he finished 7th of 12, isn't it? The 5th time in a row.
Keeping the dream alive. Brough, for the moment, thank you very much. I know you're going to stay with us. And now I've got to do something which I never thought I'd have to do, which is apologise for any language you might have found inappropriate in my earlier conversation with Mr. Brough Scott, former lead television anchor of horse racing for over 3 decades. Dear, oh dear. Brough, for the moment, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Brough will be back with us after the break when an eternal optimist, Fergal O'Brien, and a man I'd like to say is the same as